Good morning, people. I'm hoping this morning to have kind of a nuanced conversation with you. There's a topic here that I've been wanting to explore for quite a while, but it's a relatively heady one and a complicated one, and I've felt the need for a long time, in fact, to really lay the groundwork necessary for which to have this conversation. We live in an era of complicated, unprecedented rate of change, extremely dynamic interactions in relationships of all scale. That's accelerating. Our lives will become more and more and more unpredictable and dynamic as we go forward. The complications that we will find, again, in our relationships, our types of relating at all scale, internally, externally, will become more technically difficult as we go forward as a natural consequence of accelerating dynamic effects, really. We all feel this, we all sense this, but there's huge differences in the kinds of strategies that we are inclined to employ to meet these challenges. Some of them are regressive, dangerous, and absolutely destined to fail. Some are simply misguided. I'm hoping that I can offer up my perspective on this in the way that I have tried to set up a path to navigate these issues. The only reason I do this is just in a spirit of fraternity, I guess, and the hope to provide some comfort, confidence, and opportunity for those that are willing to pick those things up. But let's chat about it a little bit. We got a lot on our plate. So first of all, let's start with a perspective that is really critical. Let's talk about a philosophical bias towards looking at the world versus a religious bias in looking at the world. Okay, and I'm going to try to do this in a non-judgmental manner, but I'm going to fail ultimately. Here's what's important. Philosophy is a path. Religion is not. Okay, meaning that over the course of philosophical inquiry through history, there has been a effort all along to participate in a process of a continual path of discovery and improvement upon the knowledge of previous generations. I mean, as brilliant as we think, say, Parmenides, Pythagoras, Aristotle, Plato, on through the ages, Kant, Hume, Hegel, up as we go along. These are all individuals that are building on the shoulders of the giants before them. It's a process. No one believes that Aristotle is the final authority on anything. In fact, we can look at Aristotle, and in spite of having near awe for the expansiveness of his intellect, 99% of what Aristotle thought was wrong. Now, certainly he was the most progressive, most illuminated mind for a lot of years, and there are certainly things that he did get right, but the majority he got wrong. And that will be the case as we look at any inquiry into the world, because they all come from the context of the knowledge of their period. The knowledge of our period is greater than it was in the era of Aristotle. I'm sure if Aristotle could somehow be teleported to the modern era, he would be as brilliant as ever, and his thinking would be completely different. Wouldn't that be something? But nonetheless, philosophy is a path, either throughout culture or history, or internally. As we grow, we will start with philosophical formulations that are more archaic and more primitive, and if we continue on that path, we will move up a hierarchy of development to ideas that are more and more complicated and more relevant to the moment that we inhabit. So while there's a great deal of respect for thinkers of antiquity, especially if you put them in the context of their era, like these first movers like Pythagoras, you can't help but just be startled by. Just because they're ancient doesn't mean that they have any inherent value that is somehow special. Now, of course, religious thinkers think exactly the opposite. There's no path of discovery in religion. Sometimes, somehow, in the unfolding of history, some person evolves and they walk down a hill supposedly with stone tablets with some crap written on them supposedly, and we for all eternity are supposed to believe that that is the absolute, complete, unerrant and unchanging will of God there written on that rock. Because obviously God likes to talk to Stone Age cultures best. I mean, the religious view, what I'm getting at here, is always going to be archaic, and it is always going to be wrong, and it is always going to be out of touch with the current moment. That doesn't mean that the religious tendency in mankind is necessarily a failing. It's just that it needs to be integrated into something that's relevant for the current moment, or it becomes incredibly destructive and out of touch with reality. And of course, if you are a genuinely authentic religious individual and you are completely out of touch with reality in the moment, well, there's something really screwed up about your understanding of the nature of God, even if you thought you were believing in such a thing. Life is a process, culture is a process, humanity is a process. It is always progressive, it is always moving forward. And to be obstinate about nostalgia or attachment to ideas that have now become irrelevant is always an error. So being a naturally intuitive person who has developed the skills to temper that intuition with some discipline, I have always had an inclination towards interfaces. Either looking at, perhaps the natural world, the habitats that have always interested me the most were the riparian zones. It's always the woods on the border of the meadow. It's always the waterfowl. It's always the creatures like the otters that live in the water sometimes and on the land otherwise. The creatures that live on the interface, to me, always seem to be the most successful. And intuitively, I have mirrored that in my own life, obviously, with my SeaSteading lifestyle, living here as a largely land-based animal on my boat. The boat itself being a conveyance that takes advantages of interfaces. It's really a flying machine with one wing that's designed for air, the other wing that's designed for a medium 1,000 times more dense. I still find myself absolutely captivated by the magic of somehow harnessing that. It seems completely counterintuitive to me yet, though I understand the science, that such a vehicle could sail up into the wind. Interfaces are powerful, but they are often, if one is really nuanced about it, also a environment in which either the intuitive or the pure rational are insufficient to describe the moment. Interfaces are always complicated. One of the metaphors I like to use about this conundrum or the attraction of the interface is that an intoxicated individual walking down a hallway in the dark finds it very easy to put one hand on one wall or one hand on the other wall, but a sober man walks down the middle and he doesn't need to touch either. The middle road of the interface of balance, whether that's between intuition and rationality, whether that's sea or sky, whether that's woods or meadow, whether that's particle or wave. The magic, to me, seems to be in the interface, and that has guided me in many of my life choices for a long time. In fact, even my boat's name, a name that I didn't choose, but it seemed the boat seemed to somehow kind of through fate choose me, is Tekajik. And Tekajik in the Sinsum dialect represents a idealized form of the sea otter, which was considered a shamanic animal by most of the coast Indians up here, for precisely this reason, that it was something adept at living in both two habitats. And all of the shamanic animals were precisely those kinds of animals, because the shamanic individual who was in touch with reality lived on the interface in those traditions. They were individuals who were able to navigate the metaphysical world as well as physical reality at the same time. That's an interesting cultural value. I would suggest it's something very relevant to our current existence, something really worth contemplating, expanding on, and making personal. Now, for those of you who are better read among you, I'm sure some of you are familiar with Ken Wilber and his integral theory. I'm kind of new to Ken Wilber, really. It was interesting. So much of this thinking, for me, is simply a natural, emergent conclusion that comes really from my lifestyle. Not only living on the boats and kind of doing the SeaSteading thing, I mean, as well as living the life there, experimenting with sustainability and such on the Big Island. I do believe, really, that there is a natural path of inquiry, and there is a natural conclusion that any given individual will come to if they're honest and maybe even precocious and eager to work through this material. And as far as I'm concerned, I think the works of Wilber are some of the most interesting progressive thought out there, actually. I find Wilber especially startling because his views are certainly his own, but his core conclusions are so similar to my own independent thinking by such a very different path that I find a lot of confirmation in his material. In fact, I would suggest that the fusion of the two is important, and it precisely, I would expect that somebody like Wilber would agree, because again, integration is key to how we all think about these things. And I think anybody who's a progressive thinker today who is at the forefront of these issues recognize integration is critical. I mean, my message all along has been one that I want to flirt with the intellectual, but I also want it to be incredibly actionable and accessible. You know, I want it to be something that is academic and theoretically rigorous, yet completely livable. That's a high bar, but again, it's an attempt to not walk down the hallway with one hand on one wall or the other. It's very easy to be an academic, and it's very easy to live completely in absence of that in a very practical manner. The future is too complicated for that. We have to have our we have to live at once, like the Tekajik, like the soul catcher, like the shaman. We have to be adept in all worlds at once to navigate this complicated moment. Integration is key. It is also important, and I think one of the key observations of Wilber is that any individual that wants to walk this path of development has to walk all of the path, meaning that you're going to have to start with basic observations and first principles and develop from there. Everyone is going to spend a period of their time of their life, thinking exactly like individuals did in the past, including the near past. I mean, certainly there's going to be people along that path who are going to resonate really well with this obsolete view that is perpetrated out there by, your Ben Shapiro types or your Jordan Peterson types. Everybody's going to do that. For some people, it's not going to take very long to figure out that it's incomplete. Some people, especially those who would have found themselves very fortunate in that world, have a tendency to be very reluctant to give up those archaic notions. You will be forced to. There's just no two ways around it. To try to focus on a philosophy that is obsolete and out of touch with the current moment in reality, it's just a suicide pact. You can't do that. And in fact, you could say the same thing about postmodernist philosophy, which is exactly what many people should be reading today to understand how structures of hierarchy, power, of institutional authority have failed mankind, how they are necessarily going to fail mankind. And while it's very useful to spend a certain amount of time wallowing in the cynicism there's a lot of information there that is incredibly relevant to the moment of most people. You will have to spend some time there too. But even that philosophy is getting pretty long in the tooth. By itself, cynicism and distrust for authority does not provide actionable solutions any more than a blind trust in a fictitious truth, or the authority of the church, or silly old notions like that. Any of that kind of stuff. None of those things provide solutions in the modern era, but they do have elements of value that can be gleaned and can be brought forward and can be integrated into an amalgam that might serve us in the present moment. That is really our task. That is starting to unfold now under the general broad banner of MetaModernism, but you see a great deal of it also in deep ecology for sensible reasons. I would say that you see it evolving and emerging in feminism that comes from the indigenous community. Some of that's really brilliant thinking, in fact, because it recognizes the influence, because indigenous feminism is conversant in colonial influences and white power and privilege. It's outside of the tradition of mainstream third wave feminism, and it sees very clearly, in a postmodernist sense, the danger and the violent and exploitive nature of third wave feminism. I mean, there's stuff there that people can read that is brilliant. This is all very fringy stuff, but there are individuals out there who are looking for a solution, and they're stabbing around the issue. But the general tendency among all these groups and all these thinkers, again, as Wilbur has pointed out, is one of integration. We have to move forward. We have to take every step up the path. There are no ways of skipping steps. But in a dynamic era, as we're moving into, only dynamic, very flexible solutions are going to suffice for us. That's it. If we want to have actionable strategies that provide us with the ability to live lives, again, of personal autonomy, accountability, all these ideas that we have imported from the past, well, we will have to be as dynamic as the world we inhabit. Which brings me to what I think really my novel contribution to the conversation would be. If we understand that all of this is a process, the easiest way to enjoy perspectives that are authentic, authentic in the context of the world we actually inhabit, that are congruous with our own character, that allow us to have the courage to be honest in the real moment. Not easy stuff. The easiest way to keep that process alive is to make it a practice. I think that's thus far not really understood within the meta-modernist movement. It's still, as of yet, pretty academic. I think Wilbur certainly is closer to the idea of a practice, and much of his material, if you look at his lectures, certainly encourages his audience to view things as a practice. I would be hardcore on that score. I would say that the practice has to come first. In fact, if you make your life a practice of living on the interface, trying to walk the middle, trying to be conversant, not in either ors, but always the both, always being the one that embraces the and, knowing that in the fusion of the things that appear opposites is often the magic. If you do that and you make a practice of it, right up into things like living on a boat, you make it absolutely actionable and real, then so much of this stuff emerges for you completely of its own accord. It makes it a lot easier for these things to emerge and be discovered by you, because you are living in that interface environment that makes them necessary conclusions. If you live in environments that are either at one pole or the other most of the time, then there will be observations and truths that may conflict with either your irrational tendencies or your rational tendencies of the moment. If you are practiced and used to being able to hold both of those things at the same time, this kind of playful thinking is a lot easier to embrace. Because certainly there is a lot of confusion, again, and a lot of difficulty in navigating issues like trying to understand whether protons are particles or waves. I mean, we can claim that they have to be understood as both, but the mind naturally does rebel at that without practice. We can claim that there is such a thing as rational thinking or irrational thinking, but the fact is, it is always a fusion and an amalgam of both, and that is hard to understand. That there isn't really left or right. There's a fusion of both in the humane center. In fact, we'd start to discover that we are plagued by tremendous numbers of false dichotomies. It's like, do we exist as mind or body? Well, we are both mind and body. We need to be able to be conversant in understanding both. Do we have free will, or are our lives determined? Well, depending on how you choose to view that, you could come to either conclusion, of course, but the actual real answer is both. In fact, that's the only place where actionable strategies or useful perspectives lie. So we will continue this conversation over the next couple episodes here. I want to share, especially as I'm going to get the chance to get the boat out a bit and do some sailing again, how I have discovered a way of navigating the conundrum of modern society for myself, how I can reconcile keeping afoot basically in a modern consumerist economy while still remaining true to my core principles that are more rooted in deep ecology, how it is that I can remain constructively on the interface of both. Both is necessary to remain relevant. I mean, I could sell out and, I don't know, become a real estate broker, I suppose. Or I could go live in the woods. I mean, I've tried both. Both are incredibly unsatisfactory to me. And they have a tendency to create irrelevance in the moment. The middle way, the way of integration, of fusion, of amalgam. To me, a lot of this beckons of earlier ideas of alchemy and such, of the unpredictability of metallic alloys, perhaps. It's fascinating stuff that lives on the interface of, well, magic, really, in the most technical sense of the word. I think that there is, again, a lot of solace to be had in this kind of thinking, and it is certainly a kind of thinking that embraces, again, my core values here that I harp on over and over again, that the purpose of life is to live a life of purpose. Purpose is found in communion with other, and that always requires in the relationship some kind of fusion of opposites, or some kind of amalgam of difference. If we want to live in a more humane world as long as we're able, I suggest that that's something we really need to embrace. Embrace. That's a nice way to put it. Cheers, people.